I have been saying for years now that because of the systematic character of Hellenistic astrology, and I used the term systematic fully realizing that I ran the risk of a certain anachronism, because of this systematic character, it must have originated in the work of one man or a group of men working according to a common program. I'm here to tell you that we, that is, I and my wife Ellen Black, working along parallel lines of inquiry, have finally found that man. Briefly, this is what we've discovered. The astrology that appeared on the scene in the Mediterranean region in the 2nd or 1st century BCE of the Hellenistic era actually originated during the classical period. It was the outcome of a sustained program to interpret the signs, planets, and the so-called houses as elemental in the fullest sense of that important Greek philosophical term. The motivation behind this program was a new cosmology, that is, an account of the cosmos as a well-ordered and well-arranged whole in the original Pythagorean sense of the word. The founder of this program was the celebrated Greek polymath Eudoxus of Knidos, who, by the way, had quite a group of students. Henceforth, we should be calling this astrology Greek rather than Hellenistic, despite the fact that I have done more than my share to popularize the term Hellenistic astrology. It's hard for me to express my feelings about this discovery. My 20-year search for the source of Western astrology is finally at an end. From now on, I will be able to work just as much prospectively as retrospectively. I will explain what I mean by this distinction later. Following in the footsteps of Eudoxus in his development of a new cosmology has been a very strange experience for me, because I had been totally absorbed in Eudoxus's mathematical work in my 20s. And now, in my 60s, he is again looming large in my study of astrology. Let me introduce you to your great, I could have simply said multiply great, grand teacher, as it were. According to the most recent scholarship, Eudoxus was born around 390 BCE on the island of Knidos on the shores of Asia Minor. This would make him about 37 or 38 years younger than Plato and about 7 or 8 years older than Aristotle. He was said to have lived for 53 years, so he would have died around 337, about 10 years after Plato and about 15 years before Aristotle. I want you to take a minute to consider the implications of this unprecedented claim of mine. If it is true that Eudoxus is the progenitor of the astrology that appears on the scene during the Hellenistic era, and I believe that the evidence I will be presenting is overwhelming and in its entirety incontrovertible, it moves the origins of Western astrology back at least 200 years. This solves at one stroke many of the problems that have hounded research into the origins of Western astrology. For instance, it removes the historical objection to a Greek origin of the exaltations, something that has been obvious to me for quite some time on other grounds. It helps clarify the relation of Greek and Babylonian astrology, and perhaps most importantly, it brings us closer to understanding the philosophical presuppositions that guided and motivated the invention of Greek astrology in the first place. Not only can we rule out certain influences entirely, such as the Stoics, since Zeno, the founder of the Stoic school, was not even born until a year or two after Eudoxus died, but we do have some hints as to Eudoxus's own philosophical views found in Aristotle. In his Lives and Opinions of the Notable Philosophers, Diogenes Laertius says that Eudoxus was an astrologos and a geometer. The Greek word astrologos in Diogenes' day could have meant either an astronomer or an astrologer. There's no doubt that Eudoxus was a celebrated astronomer. Indeed, today he is remembered chiefly as an astronomer and a geometer. As a mathematical astronomer, he developed the first mathematical model of planetary motion, accounting in a geometrical way for the apparent irregularities in the motions of the planets with his theory of concentric spheres. Eudoxus is reported to have said that he would gladly be burnt up like Phaethon if only he could get close enough to the sun to observe it directly. As a descriptive astronomer, he spent much time making his own observations of star positions and star groupings. These observations were recorded in a book called Phenomena, and also in a book with the enigmatical title Mirror. In these books, he also assigned Greek names to the constellations and signs of the zodiac, the majority apparently for the first time. The surviving fragments of these two books will be of primary concern to us in this talk. But there is also little doubt that Eudoxus was at least acquainted with the practice of astrology. In his treatise on divination, Cicero cites Eudoxus as a man who gave no credence to the Chaldean, that is, Babylonian practice of foretelling the life of an individual from the day of his birth. Historian of mathematics Thomas Heath infers from this remark that Eudoxus was a quote-unquote true man of science, for whom occult or superstitious lore, such as astrology, had no appeal. Otto Neugebauer pointed out that this remark might not be directed at Chaldean astrology at all, but at some other means of divination from the day of birth instead. From the context of Cicero's remark, it's fairly clear that this remark is in fact about astrology. However, I take the remark to mean that Eudoxus rejected Chaldean astrology, leaving open the possibility that he would not necessarily have rejected the very idea of some kind of astrology. I do agree with Heath that Eudoxus was a true man of science, but not in quite the sense that he meant it, or in the same sense that any modern scientist would mean it. All historians agree that Eudoxus was among the greatest of the Greek geometers, and some even consider him to be the greatest. One of the reasons for this assessment was his interest in general theorems, that is, theorems that are common to all the different kinds of quantity, numbers, lines, planar surfaces, solids, times, etc., and also general problem-solving methods as well, in particular, something the Greeks called the method of analysis and synthesis, which was of particular interest to me in my youth. As you will see, Eudoxus took this penchant for generality of treatment farther than any historian of thought ever imagined. I will say something about his accomplishments in mathematics as the need or occasion arises. Diogenes goes on to say that Eudoxus was also a physician and a nomothetes, a Greek word that means a setter of custom or a framer of laws. He may in fact have held such an office, since he was highly honored in his home city of Cnidos. However, Plato uses this very same word in his dialogue Cratylus in a somewhat unusual context. The question of the dialogue is whether there is a natural rightness to names, or whether they are merely the result of agreement or convention. After characterizing names as a kind of tool for disentangling being, an interesting formulation in itself, the question becomes, if there is a natural rightness to names, doesn't it require a craftsman of the highest order to fashion names appropriate to things? And isn't such a person the rarest of all craftsmen? It is at this point in the dialogue in which these questions are raised that Socrates uses the term nomothetes, lawgiver, to describe a giver of names. Now, Eudoxus certainly acted as a nomothetes in something like this transferred sense when he chose names for the constellations and signs of the zodiac. He was not, however, for the most part coining names, but choosing them from the available pool of names already coined for terrestrial entities. If a name is a kind of tool, as Plato says in the Cratylus, then Eudoxus is not so much fashioning the proper tool as selecting the proper tool from amongst those already fashioned. But one selects a particular tool because he has a certain purpose in mind. And the selection of the proper tool must be done with just as much care as the fashioning of the tool in the first place. It too requires a skilled craftsman. In the next part of this course, you will see the extraordinary care with which Eudoxus went about selecting the proper names for the zodiac signs and the extraordinary measures he took to find them. And right now you should begin to ask yourself the question, what purpose might Eudoxus have had in mind? What work did he hope to accomplish, to bring to completion with his nomenclature? I will also be arguing that it was Eudoxus who chose the Greek deific names for the planets. This has been something of a mystery. In Plato's Timaeus, only Helios, Selene, and the star of Hermes are mentioned. The passage goes on to say that the Greeks had so little knowledge of the motions of the planets that either they had not yet been named at all, or the names were known only to a wise few. The passage is somewhat ambiguous on this point. However, by the time of the composition of the Epinomis, thought to have been written by Plato's student Philip sometime not long after Plato's death, the deific names of the remaining 4 planets had already been assigned. It is therefore quite possible that the naming of the planets was completed between the composition of these 2 dialogues, that is, during Eudoxus's own lifetime. The Belgian classicist and editor of Greek astrological texts, Franz Cumat, expressed the opinion that the deific names go back to the Pythagorean philosopher Philolaus. His argument basically boils down to this: Philolaus was the earliest Greek philosopher to explicitly assert that the wanderer stars were deities. However, there is a curiously pointed parenthetical remark in the Epinomis when it comes to the assignment of the name Aphrodite. It says that this was an appropriate name for a Syrian nomothetes to choose. Now, as far as I've been able to determine, at the time of the composition of the Epinomis, the name Syria could refer generically to any of the countries of Asia Minor. And Eudoxus was a native of Knidos, on the shores of Asia Minor. Aphrodite was the patron goddess of the city, and her head appeared on all their coins. Not only that, but Knidos was home to a famous statue of Aphrodite in the nude, striking because it was not the custom to portray female goddesses unclothed. Finally, one of the controversial opinions that Eudoxus held as a philosopher was that pleasure was the highest good in human life, although Aristotle says that Eudoxus himself was a man of utmost temperance. Aphrodite, of course, was the goddess of pleasure. So this passage in the dialogue would seem to be an allusion to Eudoxus himself. Let that be as it may. As I indicated above, Eudoxus chose the names of the signs to meet certain criteria. Of this, there can be no doubt. I will be presenting an overwhelming amount of evidence to this effect. I will show that the criteria that had to be met in the selection of the deific names of the planets were of exactly the same sort. This makes it almost certain that the same man, acting in the office of a nomothetes, chose the deific names of the planets as well as the terrestrial names of the signs, and did so for a specific purpose. Eudoxus was also a geographer who traveled widely throughout the Mediterranean area and wrote a book called Tour of the Earth. It is perhaps important to note that he spent 16 months in Egypt studying with the priests at Heliopolis, where there was also an observatory where he made many of his celestial observations. However, in all the historical record, there is no report that would lead one to seriously consider the possibility that Eudoxus was the founder of an astrological program, which of course is good reason why no one has ever made my claim. No doubt the scientific types will have an apoplectic fit about this, since Eudoxus is one of their heroes. There was a time not long ago when Ptolemy's authorship of the Tetrabiblos was questioned, simply because historians of science could not believe that such a man of science as Ptolemy could possibly have been involved in that astrologic nonsense, as George Sarton liked to call it. So what are my grounds? Diogenes also tells us that Eudoxus gave lectures on the gods, the cosmos, and on the subject of matters on high, which usually meant the celestial bodies and their appearances. I regard this as a highly significant remark. It means that Eudoxus, like most thinkers of his day, was interested in cosmology, in giving an account of the cosmos as a well-ordered, well-arranged whole. Now, we have all heard the expression that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. This, of course, is only true if the parts are not simply aggregated into a confused mass, but are somehow bound together while retaining their distinctness, and furthermore are arranged in a meaningful way. Now, I don't think anyone would reject the possibility that Eudoxus had a cosmology, but in astrology? Why in the name of heaven would I say that? Because when it's properly understood, Greek astrology is a cosmology. It is Eudoxus's cosmology. And why would I say that it is his? Because there are many astrological concepts encrypted in his celestial nomenclature or immediately implied. I will be spending a good portion of this part of the course and the next drawing those astrological concepts out of his nomenclature. There is one historical argument that I will make about the antiquity of Greek astrology. I will show that there are some unmistakable affinities between some astrological doctrines and the thought of Aristotle, and these doctrines can be found in the writings of the legendary founders Hermes, Nicepso, etc. Now, it's a strange fact that at the time the astrology came on the scene, around the 2nd century BCE, the philosophical writings that now bear the name of Aristotle were not in general circulation. Cicero, for instance, was not acquainted with them, and Cicero was at the center of the intellectual activity of his day. The Aristotelian writings I am referring to were not published until after Cicero's death by Andronicus of Rhodes in the 1st century BCE. This indicates that many central astrological concepts were introduced by someone directly acquainted with Aristotle or familiar with his writings while they were still available. At the present time, I can say with almost complete certainty that Eudoxus introduced the sect distinction and the sect-related rejoicing conditions, the exaltations, the planetary joys, planetary configuration, and in all probability, the Hermetic lots. It's also beyond doubt that he associated the 4 physical elements with the signs. The reason I can be certain of these claims is that all these concepts and others are all bound together and interrelated in a system. There's that word system again. There is at present no way of knowing whether Eudoxus lived to complete his cosmology, but the principles behind it are clear enough once they are pointed out. It may be that his students completed his program, but the system definitely bears the stamp of one guiding intelligence. I said that Greek astrology, as initiated by Eudoxus, is a cosmology. Greek astrology is not something based on a cosmology or appended to one or an outgrowth of one. I repeat, the concepts of Greek astrology constitute a cosmology, and these concepts cannot be divorced from the cosmology they constitute. This cosmology may or may not be a true one, but the concepts are inseparable from it. There may be other cosmologies that would make an astrology viable, but they would have to have their own astrological concepts stemming from those cosmologies and appropriate to them. The Greek astrological concepts are meaningful only within the context of the cosmology that they constitute. As such, they could only be artificially grafted onto some other cosmological framework or worldview. They could never give it integrity. Eudoxus spent time in Athens with Plato, accompanied by a large troop of his students, and it's hard to believe that he would not have been personally acquainted with Aristotle as well, while Aristotle was a member of the Platonic Academy. So he almost certainly would have been well informed about the philosophical inquiry taking place there. Not too much is known of Eudoxus's own philosophical views from historical reports alone. Diogenes Laertius considers him the last member of the original Pythagorean school, a school noted for its secrecy, by the way. As I said above, Aristotle reports that Eudoxus considered pleasure the highest good in human life, although he goes on to say that Eudoxus himself was a man of exceptional temperance. But what will be of more immediate concern to us is Aristotle's statement that Eudoxus wanted to mix the intelligibles, those invisible entities accessible to thought alone, with sensible things. This view, that the intelligibles were mixed with sensible things, would put Eudoxus at variance with Plato, who held that the intelligibles had their existence apart from sensible things, which are in some mysterious sense copies of the intelligible originals. And it would put him more in accord with Aristotle, for whom the forms or intelligibles were likewise at work in matter. However, Aristotle is critical of Eudoxus's term mixed because it implies both an original separateness of the intelligibles from the sensibles or a subsequent separability. For Aristotle, the intelligibles, though in themselves still pure and unchangeable as they are for Plato, are inseparable from sensibles and always embodied and at work in a suitable underlying matter or medium. Aristotle also wonders what the efficacy of the intelligibles could be if the intelligibles were mixed in sensible things as Eudoxus supposed. For Aristotle, the efficacy of an intelligible is that it attracts suitable material to itself and is thereby responsible for what the material comes to be. I believe that Eudoxus did have a position on the efficacy of his mixed intelligibles, one that can be inferred from the astrological texts and from certain principles of Neo-Pythagorean thought, which I maintain actually stem from Eudoxus himself. I believe that he held that the intelligible in its original separation is attracted to suitable material, and so informs it, instead of the reverse, as Aristotle would have it. However, I believe that Eudoxus's metaphysical views also had something in common with Plato's, despite their disagreement on the mode of existence of the intelligibles. Here again, I am partly making inferences from the astrological material itself. They both seem to be of the opinion that there was a kind of arithmetical structure to the intelligibles. In this regard, both Eudoxus and Plato may be understood as transferring Pythagorean arithmetical presuppositions, which were always directed to the sensible world, to the realm of the intelligibles, even though the original Pythagoreans did not recognize an independent existence of the monads of counting and calculating. However, they seem to have differed, that is, Plato and Eudoxus, on one important point. For Plato, the elements that constitute an intelligible do not mix, but form a kind of community. For Eudoxus, all these elements are mixed together in all sensible things, but in different proportions, so that some predominate over others. Their mixture, however, is not one of mingling or blending, but one of interrelationship. In this regard, Eudoxus is evidently following in the footsteps of Anaxagoras. This Eudoxian notion of mixture, in which certain elemental intelligibles predominate over others in sensible things, is not perhaps as fantastic as it might seem at first. It appears to be an attempt to account for the infinite diversity we find in sensible things. It is a principle of individuation. Now, no two leaves, no two snowflakes, no two men are identical in every respect. Plato's explanation for this is that no two copies of the same intelligible original can be the same. Aristotle's is that all differences in sensible things are simply due to differences in the material that is being worked upon and informed by the intelligible. According to Aristotle's own report, the notion of mixture was a view first put forward by Anaxagoras, who was about a generation older than Socrates, although it is not entirely clear if Anaxagoras himself meant that intelligibles, as Plato understood them, were mixed in sensible things. This may have been a step initiated by Eudoxus himself. Thus, Eudoxus's metaphysics stands midway between that of Plato and Aristotle. If Eudoxus was following in the footsteps of Anaxagoras on this issue, we can elaborate this hypothesis of mixture a bit more, because as a philosopher, Anaxagoras was known for two claims above all. One, the basis for his cosmology, and the other the basis of his cosmogony. The first exerted a fascination on both Plato and Aristotle, namely that nous, as divine mind, orders everything in the cosmos and is responsible for everything that occurs in the cosmos, for everything that was, everything that is, and everything that will be. Both Plato and Aristotle expressed disappointment that Anaxagoras did not pursue this astonishing insight further, but, as Aristotle put it, he only used it as a kind of deus ex machina of explanation. Plato tried to take this insight further in his Timaeus, and from a certain point of view, Aristotle's entire opus can be seen as an elaboration of this idea. Anaxagoras' second central claim was that the cosmos emerged from a primordial chaos in which everything was thoroughly and uniformly mixed together, the rare with the dense, the hot with the cold, the bright with the dark, and the wet with the dry. It was divine mind that set everything in this chaos in a circular motion that, through a kind of centrifugal force, caused things in the primordial mixture to become roughly segregated in different places, and at the same time, the things in those places to become more closely segregated and mixed. However, the segregation could not ever be complete, so that a part of everything remained in everything. The primary difficulty in this account, which has plagued scholars since the time of Plato and Aristotle, concerns the mode of existence of the hot and the cold, the bright and dark, and wet and dry. If they are simply mixed with each other and with the rare and the dense. On the surface, Anaxagoras seems to mean that the hot and the cold and the other pairs are mixed with the rare and the dense. Through the circular motion, the dense will separate out from the rare and congregate mostly near the center, though the separation will never be complete. The dense will further separate into water and earth, but again the separation can never be complete. The rare will mostly congregate farther from the center and further segregate incompletely into fire and air, and the hot and the cold and the other pairs remain mixed with all of these, though in varying proportions. The problem is what is meant by the hot and the cold and the other pairs. Is it hot stuff, cold stuff, etc., where the stuff meant is special to hot or cold and other than the rare or the dense stuff? Is it hot as a quality of dense stuff or rare stuff and cold likewise? Or does he mean by the hot and the cold entities that Plato would consider to be intelligibles? Aristotle evidently thought that Anaxagoras meant the latter. He criticizes his doctrine of mixture by pointing out that to call it a mixture implies an original separation, and what is mixed can subsequently be separated. This would mean that the hot could be separated from the dense or rare stuff that has it as a quality, that the hot could exist separately from any stuff at all. And this Aristotle will not allow. For him, no quality, property, disposition, or other sensible attribute can exist apart from a corporeal substratum. I'm not entirely certain that Plato would agree with Aristotle on this point. In the second part of the Timaeus, which seems to take off from Anaxagoras's primordial chaos, he seems to entertain the possibility that the power of acting that we associate with the hot and the power of acting that we associate with the cold, as well as the capacities for being acted upon that we call the wet and dry, may in some manner pre-exist their embodiment and limitation in material form. But this is an issue I'll take up at another time. I have treated of Anaxagoras' cosmogenic and cosmological thought in some detail here, because if Plato and Aristotle tried to improve on Anaxagoras, it's a fair assumption that Eudoxus would have been tempted to give it a try as well. I have said repeatedly in the past that Hellenistic astrology did not originate empirically, that is, in concepts drawn from experience. Anyone who still thinks it did is living in fantasy land. The Greek system of astrology had to be generated. When Eudoxus began his program, he would have had his astronomical distinctions between wanderer stars and non-wandering stars at his disposal. The normalized zodiac of 12 equal signs would have been available to him from the Babylonians. He may have taken from them some general notion that there may be a special significance when certain planets are in certain signs of the zodiac. And since he spent some time with the Egyptian priesthood at an astronomical observatory in Heliopolis, he was no doubt aware of the division of each sign into 3 decans. It is also possible that the Egyptians were already studying the rising decan and the position of the other decans relative to it, in terms of topics in human life, although it seems possible to me that this Egyptian practice was actually influenced by Eudoxus. The compilation of correlations between the heliacal rising and setting of bright fixed stars with weather patterns, called parapegmata in Greek, was a work begun prior to Eudoxus in the Greek world, and he himself contributed to it. It is not clear to me whether this should properly be called astrology, but insofar as Eudoxus rejected the methods of the Chaldeans, the Babylonians that is, as Cicero reports, there would be no compilations of correlations between celestial phenomena and human events for Eudoxus to draw on. Think of it. Before Eudoxus, the celestial phenomenon would have been a blur, or perhaps I should rather say, so much noise, a constantly changing landscape of planets moving around against the background of the fixed stars, and all the stars rising and setting relative to the horizon and Helios. Every successive snapshot of the heavens being different from the one preceding. If someone supposed that he could see something about the course of an individual human life in these phenomena, it would be like trying to read a foreign language that one does not know. You do not know the words, you do not know if small changes in the spelling of what looks like the same word make a difference, and if they do, what that difference is. You do not know if a different order of the same words has any meaning. You do not have any idea how to parse the sentence or diagram it, because you simply do not know what words or groups of words go together and which don't. And in ancient languages in particular, you may not even know where one word ends and another begins, or even when one sentence ends and another begins. The situation is quite hopeless from an empirical standpoint. What is needed is something to guide your inspection of the heavens and train your vision, something that will help you articulate and resolve the blur of the celestial phenomena into significant subclasses of phenomena. So I assume that when Eudoxus begins his work, there is nothing given in the empirical sense. The planets have as yet no significations, and the signs have as yet no characteristics, for they don't even have names. The use of the horizon to locate planets and fixed stars is of astronomical import, but the system of 12 places defined relative to the hour marker has no other significance. There are as yet no concepts of astrological classification. There is no concept of planetary sect. There are no sect-related rejoicing conditions, whether by gendered hexagon or by the hemisphere occupied by Helios. There is no identification of the planets as benefic or malefic. There are no groupings of the signs, no gendered hexagons, no elemental trigons with their tetragonal differentiations. There are no good and bad places defined relative to the hour marker, no concept of an angular triad with its distinction into pivots, declines, and succeeding places. There are no concepts relating planets to one another, no concept of planetary configuration, no lot concept. There are no rulership concepts relating planets to signs, no planetary domiciles, no exaltations, no trigon lords. There are no rulership concepts relating planets to subdivisions of the signs, either the individual portions themselves or the irregular subdivisions I call confines. There is no concept of the joys of the planets relating the planets to the so-called houses, and there is no thema mundi. And because Eudoxus had none of these concepts, there were no general principles of astrological interpretation, no ways of studying the life of a native as a whole, no way of investigating specific topics in a human life, and no time lords to time events. In short, there was no astrology at all. It is perhaps understandable that most modern astrologers still cling to the myth that astrology originated empirically, like any other modern science. That is, from the accumulated observations of centuries, or perhaps even millennia, of astrologers reading charts and correlating celestial events to the lives of human beings. The reduced form in which modern astrology finds itself might make the empirical foundations seem almost plausible. If one looks only at the planets, signs, houses, and aspects, one could perhaps imagine that they could be subjected to some kind of empirical study, because there are only a few things to look at. But the long list of concepts and classes of concepts I enumerated above, with their intrinsic interconnections, no way. If they had been derivable by observation grounded in correlation, then surely the Babylonians would have had these concepts, since they are the only ancient people that we can be certain did record such correlations over a very long period of time, even millennia. Certainly, there is no evidence of a long history of compiling correlations in the Greek world. But with only one or two exceptions, there is absolutely no evidence that the Babylonians came up with any of the Greek astrological concepts on their own. And then, again, there is Cicero's report that Eudoxus rejected Babylonian astrology. So we are left with the Greek invention of an astrology based on metaphysical reasoning, one in which the concepts of the astrology are developed prior to experience, or a priori, as Kant would say, and subsequently given content by identifying the celestial phenomena that best exhibit these concepts. Some might point out that I have left out a third possibility, that the astrology was based on mystical experience. I do not entirely rule out this possibility, largely because the longer I study Greek thought, the harder it is for me to find the boundaries between what the Greeks had access to in their metaphysical inquiries and what might be revealed to a mystic in an ecstatic experience. Now, if Eudoxus could not begin his development of an astrology with the usual empirical sources, with concepts drawn from experience, that is abstracted from individual instances that have something in common, how could he ever get underway? He would have to have found a way to generate his concepts first, and only then discover what might best exhibit them in the celestial phenomena. I need to coin a term to describe this process. I will call it reverse empiricism, because it reverses the natural process of abstraction, which leads from sensible particulars to a general or common concept. Now, if Western astrology developed in this way, and I intend to fully demonstrate that it did, that is, if it developed in accordance with a kind of reverse empiricism, you should be getting very nervous right now about the entire enterprise of Western astrology. What I'm claiming comes perilously close to an assertion that Western astrology was wholly made up, the intellectual fantasy of an ivory tower metaphysician, assisted perhaps by his equally delusional students. I have lived with such nervousness for a very long time, ever since I began to see that the concepts of this astrology had a systematic arrangement, but could not possibly have had an empirical foundation. Yet I couldn't deny what I was seeing retrospectively. What I didn't know at the time, and what I have gradually come to understand over the past few years, is that Eudoxus's method of astrological concept formation was rigorously guided by a program to interpret the signs, planets, and so-called houses as elemental in the fullest sense of that Greek concept, as I said at the very beginning of this lecture. There are, in fact, a few Greek texts that explicitly call planets and signs elements. But the proof that elemental considerations lie at the basis of Greek astrology is that by their means, I can actually generate its system of concepts prospectively. I am going to give you more than just a taste of how this can be done in this lecture. I assume, then, that for Eudoxus, there was nothing empirically given upon which he could develop an astrology. There was, however, the metaphysical presupposition entertained by most of the Greek thinkers that the two lights and the five wanderer stars had an existence intermediate between the things of the sensible world, which are visible and undergo all manner of change, and the intelligibles of the supersensible world, which are invisible and unchangeable, being on the one hand visible, and on the other hand imperishable and unchanging, except as regards position. The celestial bodies were regarded as having one characteristic in common with the sensibles and the other in common with the intelligibles. This is why Aristotle can describe astronomy as the science that is most akin to philosophy. I want you to remember how the entities in these two realms were contrasted, namely in terms of two pairs of contraries, visible versus invisible, changeable versus unchangeable. In both cases, by the possession of a property and its privation. In this characterization, the entities existing in these two realms are completely opposite to one another. The celestial bodies mediate by having one characteristic in common with the sensibles, visibility, and one characteristic in common with the intelligibles, their unchangeability. You will see this structure of twofold opposition and mediation again. From this perspective, the true problem of astrology is not how the heavens and earth are connected in such a way that there are correlations between celestial and human events. Historically, this reduction of the problem of astrology has produced only two solutions, neither of which is ultimately supportable or very satisfying. Either the celestial realm exerts some kind of influence over human affairs and/or human consciousness, or there is a kind of pre-established but ultimately inexplicable harmony or synchronism between the celestial realm and the human realm. But in my opinion, the problem of astrology is hopelessly insoluble when it is posed in this reduced way. Let me explain what I mean by quoting from Hegel's Philosophy of Mind in the William Wallace translation, which is suitable enough for my present purposes. Here's the quote. As regards the connection of soul with the solar system, we may note that astrology links the destinies of humanity and of individuals with the configurations and positions of the planets. The content of astrology is to be rejected as superstition, but science is under the obligation to assign the specific ground for this rejection. This ground must not be simply that the planets are only bodies and remote from us, but more specifically that the planetary life of the solar system is only a life of motion. In other words, is a life in which the determining factor is constituted by space and time, for space and time are the moments of motion. But for mind, the abstract determinations of space and time, the mechanics of free motion, have absolutely no significance and no power. The determinations of self-conscious mind are infinitely more substantial, more concrete, than the abstract determinations of juxtaposition and succession." Unquote. I have always considered this the most devastating argument against the possibility of astrology ever advanced, and we have to take it seriously. It is particularly devastating for anyone who thinks that astrology could have had an empirical origin. What we can simply observe about their planets is their juxtaposition and change of place. And how could we ever derive from these categories enough determinations to ever hope to account for the richness of human life? Notice that this argument applies just as much to anyone seeking a causal explanation for astrology as to anyone thinking in terms of synchronism. To this, I say that in its original form, the true problem of astrology was how the celestial realm binds the supersensible realm of the intelligibles to the sensible realm in which we humans go about our business. Because for most of the Greek philosophers, and this would include Eudoxus, It is the A-Day, those invisible and unchangeable entities accessible to thought alone, those entities in some mysterious way embodied and conveyed in the invisible medium of human speech. It is the A-Day that are ultimately responsible for individual things or occurrences coming to be or passing away, and for their being what they are while they exist. And the realm of these A-Day, these intelligibles, however they are thought to exist, is certainly full enough, rich enough to overcome Hegel's objection. Modern astrology might seem to have addressed this argument by importing the Jungian archetypes into astrology, which admittedly have a certain richness that goes beyond the simple determinations of space and time, and in fact are even understood to transcend space and time. However, to what celestial entities should these archetypes be assigned, and for what reason? By Rudier's own account, they are meant to replace the traditional significations of the planets, the characteristics of the signs, and the topics associated with the places, which he takes to have been discovered empirically. The concepts of modern psychological astrology are likewise transferred from the traditional concepts without worrying about where these concepts come from. In either case, game over. And then, of course, there is that magical synchronicity concept, the deus ex machina of modern astrology. Nonsense, all nonsense. So let me return to the Greek perspective. The problem of astrology gets more interesting when we consider that for most all Greek thinkers, the celestial realm is understood to be stratified. Farthest from the earth is the sphere of the fixed stars. Beneath this is the realm of the planets with their own spheres, and beneath this, the sublunary realm, the world below the sphere of Selene and containing the earth at its center. The earth is the realm of the four physical elements: fire, air, water, earth. So the sublunary world, properly speaking, is the realm beyond the earth's atmosphere and beneath the sphere of Selene. And beyond the sphere of the fixed stars, well, that depends to some extent on which philosopher we are following. But there is an almost irrepressible impulse, a trend, let me just call it that for now, to associate that region with the intelligibles in separation from anything material, and for some, even Aristotle, with a divine mind or nous containing all these intelligibles, ordering everything in the cosmos and responsible for everything that occurs, as Anaxagoras originally put it in a remark that had enormous impact on Plato, Aristotle, and certainly Eudoxus. This realm is considered to be timeless by the Greek philosophers. Whether it is actually beyond the sphere of the fixed stars or somehow permeating the entire cosmos may be a matter of dispute, but it does not essentially affect anything I intend to say. It will be helpful for visualization purposes to suppose it beyond the sphere of the fixed stars. So the problem of astrology in its fullest expression is how our earthly realm is linked to the realm of the intelligibles through the mediation of the sphere of the fixed stars, the seven spheres of the planets, and the sublunary realm. I would go so far as to say that the cosmos must ultimately be constituted in some such way as I have described in order to make astrology possible. Of the three mediating realms, it seems that the planet realm does not only have centrality for Eudoxus, but it also has a certain primacy over the others in creating the tightest bond between the earthly realm and the realm of the intelligibles. Consider that the three principal sources of Greek astrological delineation are planets and signs mapped out on the sphere of the fixed stars, planets in relation to each other in configuration, and planets in the so-called houses that articulate the sublunary world into 12 places relative to a local horizon. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If the cosmos is to be bound together as a whole to the fullest extent possible, it would be even better if the sphere of the fixed stars and the sublunary world independently link the sensible realm to the intelligible realm. First, I will address the sphere of the fixed stars, which, according to tradition prior to Eudoxus, was associated with changes in the weather on Earth, studied in the heliacal risings and settings of the fixed stars, as I said above. And weather is a matter of hot versus cold and wet versus dry, and these are the four qualities associated by the Greeks with the four elements: fire, air, water, earth. Now, the intelligibles as such are not only invisible but also incorporeal. But corporeality is a second defining characteristic of entities in the sensible world, and itself underlies the Greek doctrine of the four elements. And ultimately, it is these four elements that are also understood to be subject to change in the sensible realm. We have a need, then, to identify something in the sphere of the fixed stars that is incorporeal and at the same time something that, even though it is not tangible in the sense we are able to touch it, is at least something that can touch us and be felt. This something will, of course, turn out to be a sign of the zodiac, but we have a ways to go before we get to it. At the moment, all we have is an empty concept of something associated with the sphere of the fixed stars that will serve to link the intelligibles to the sensibles in terms of an incorporeality that may nonetheless be sensed as something felt. Any Greek cosmology requires a fully developed concept of place, since there is no other way of seeing the cosmos as a well-ordered and well-arranged whole. But there is nothing whatsoever visible or corporeal in it. It is only a region, a space empty of visible body. So how could it be possibly understood to provide a link between any realms of any kinds, let alone between the intelligibles and the sensibles? Well, as Plato says in the Timaeus, place has a curious kind of intelligibility. I will be discussing this shortly. But it's also place that allows us to perceive the phenomenon of locomotion. So it is a kind of precondition of this perception. That is all I want to say about place for the moment. You will be hearing much more as I go on.